and welcome to EconVersations. I'm your host, Dr. Dan Sutter of the Johnson Center for Political Economy at Troy University. Polaris announced in January 2015 that it would be building a new plant to build off-road vehicles in Huntsville, due in large part to a set of economic development package incentives offered by our state. Polaris joins a long list of companies that includes automakers Mercedes-Benz, Honda, and Hyundai, and steelmaker ThyssenKrupp have all been brought to our state due to a combination of tax, regulatory, and other incentives offered by our state officials. Does such government-led economic growth really help our state's economy? Joining me to discuss this important question is my colleague from the Johnson Center, Dr. George Crowley. George, welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Now, just before we get started here, I want to mention that this study that you've done is part of our Johnson Center's Improving Lives in Alabama project, right?
Yes. Yeah, it's going to be part of this book project that we've kind of been unveiling as we go here, and I'm excited to be part of it.
And this is a really important issue for our state because, on the one hand, it really sort of started with Mercedes back more than 20 years ago, the package of incentives that were offered to bring Mercedes to Alabama. This has been a big part of our economic development strategy in the state, hasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, we usually do point back to the Mercedes project in the early 90s. Alabama has kind of led the way as far as these large-scale government-led incentive package deals that are designed to recruit specific businesses into the state, usually large-scale manufacturers.
And just to be clear, in Alabama, though, we were one of the pioneers. The Mercedes deal got lots of attention nationally. Alabama's by far not the only company that's used these packages to try to recruit companies.
Right, absolutely. Especially we see this around in the Southeast for a lot of these automobile companies when they decide they want to set up a plant in the United States. You see these states essentially each offer their own brand of incentive packages. Alabama was kind of at the forefront of that. We were able to land the first U.S. manufacturer for Mercedes through the use of these incentive deals, but they're certainly not the only ones.
So these deals often include a whole bunch of different components. So let's talk a little bit about what was involved with the deal for Mercedes.
Sure. So the usual kind of package, and some of them specific for Mercedes are listed here, but the usual kind of mix of incentives are things like abating taxes that normal companies would have to pay. But you can also see payments from the state in terms of infrastructure. We'll build some additional roadways, or we'll even secure the site and help you build your actual plant there. All the way down to training services that the state will provide. But usually the main thrust of these packages is the abatement of taxes. For a certain amount of time, this company, if you locate here, you won't have to pay the normal set of taxes that other manufacturers in the state would have to pay. And
there can be regulatory relief as well, right? There's some impact studies and things like that you have to go through to start to build especially a manufacturing plant these days.
Right. So one of the things that you often see essentially nullified is the usual state requirement that you have to do some kind of environmental impact study. That will either be waived or the state will actually provide that study for you. And there's other types of regulations that often get at least partially mitigated.
There's a whole, as we mentioned, a whole variety of incentives that are being offered here, and some of which are breaks and some are incentives. Now, from an economist standpoint, as we look at this, what kind of issues do these types of incentive packages raise?
Well, one of the things that kind of troubles a lot of economists is the idea that these are targeted to very specific companies. So it's not that this is like a package that's available to, if you come locate in the Alabama, you'll get this package. It's usually tailored and usually negotiated with the company as far as here's the very specific set of things we will give you, Mercedes, or some of the other companies we've lured here. We'll give these very specific tailored package to just this specific company. And it's this kind of, for lack of a better term, unfairness between where we target a specific company and give them a special type of tax relief that's not available to some other manufacturers in the state that troubles a lot of economists. The other major issue is that a lot of times once these deals are struck, there's very little oversight or accountability down the road to make sure that the number of promised jobs, for instance, have actually panned out.
Now, with regard to taxes, and normally, regular viewers of this program might well be thinking that Johnson Center economists would normally be saying that lowering taxes on business is a good deal. And so it might strike people as a little odd that we're raising some red flags, or at least somewhat troubled by the element of tax breaks for businesses included here. And certainly some people on the political left will sometimes point to the, deals like this as saying that they're completely undercutting a state or local government's tax base and depriving the government of the needed revenues that it will need to provide schools or roads or the other things that governments do. So again, let's expand on this a little bit.
Yeah, sure. And I would certainly be one of those economists that generally is in favor of lower tax burdens on businesses and individuals. The issue here again comes down to the idea that whether we're going to target specific businesses and say you will have lower tax burden, or if we could find a way to lower the tax burden across the board so that all businesses get to compete on a level playing field. There's this other added issue that has come up even in our state as far as where are these monies for some of these training services and infrastructure improvements. These monies are coming from somewhere, be it perhaps education or some other services that the government should be providing, and instead they're going to a specific company. The main issue here is, of course, the idea of targeted specific tax breaks for a specific well-connected politically firm, or a level playing field where we lower taxes across the board. And it really boils down to the idea that we don't generally want individual politicians or groups of politicians picking specific winners and losers, as it were, picking specific firms to come locate to the state. That should really be something that should be done by the market itself.
Because I guess as sometimes being a critic or being irascible, I would point to like the recent deal with Polaris and say like, oh, well, our state officials just acknowledged again that the businesses in our state face a crushing tax and regulatory burden, and of course they recognize if anyone's really going to want to come and open a business in Alabama, we have to give you all kinds of breaks. We couldn't actually make you pay all the taxes and comply with all the regulations you would have to normally, right?
So there's something certainly to that, and it's something that fascinated me as I looked through some of these specific deals. One of the things that often comes up is in addition to these kind of cash incentives, one of the things that comes up is usually an agreement that the state will help the business locate any of the tax benefits that they're entitled to. To me, anyway, that speaks to your point, which is the idea that the tax code is already so complicated that we have to offer government services to help you find tax breaks. So it certainly does speak to perhaps a overarching theme as far as a overburdensome tax code, that we have to offer these types of incentives to lure them to the state. And again, to my point earlier, that perhaps the better strategy would be to across the board cuts of taxes so that the playing field is essentially level.
Now, I think beyond the tax issue and perhaps regulatory relief, we do have, as you mentioned here, some things that are being provided at taxpayer expense, which I think probably does raise a completely different issue than whether we want to provide tax relief for certain businesses. The question, in the case of Mercedes, the state paid quite a bit of the training expenses, like to build them a training facility and so forth. And I think that that is a different issue, right?
Yeah, and I think this gets back to the other point as far as where are these monies coming from. These are presumably monies that, well, it would perhaps be nice to think they'd get refunded to taxpayers, and they would more likely be spent on other types of government services. There's no such thing as a free lunch, even for the government. So presumably the money we're spending on things like training services, things like infrastructure improvements, things that even all the way down to getting people to write these various impact studies that otherwise the company would have to do itself. These monies are coming from somewhere, and that means a curtailing of services that the government would normally provide.
Now, sometimes incentive packages like this are defended on the grounds that, well, once a business like this locates here, there'll be other sources of tax revenue. There'll be, whether it be other supplier companies that are coming in to deal with Mercedes, or when their employees relocate here and they buy houses, they'll be paying property taxes and they'll be supporting other businesses. And so conceivably, you could make an argument that there could be some other tax revenues coming back to this, and it could end up being a nice overall investment for the state in terms of you give up a little bit of money now, but in terms of some other tax revenues coming in the future, right?
Yeah, and this is the logic usually, right? Is that we bring a large manufacturer to the state, and not only will that manufacturer employ several hundred, or in some of these cases even 1,000 workers, which is already kind of a net benefit. It will also perhaps bring suppliers, we're giving high-paying jobs to these 1,000 workers, so they now have more disposable income to go out and spend on other businesses in the area. And it's supposed to have this kind of over and above just the fact that the plant's set up there, this over and above kind of effect on the rest of the surrounding area. This is certainly the logic that is behind this type of development policy. Yeah, I mean, to your point, that's what proponents are certainly advocating.
Another issue that state policies and state assistance like this raises is at the national level. The issues about where a plant locates within the United States are different than whether a plant locates in Alabama or not. So, how's the perspective from the national perspective versus the state or local perspective important here?
Yeah, so whenever one of these large-scale companies, so be it more recently Airbus, when they were planning to locate in the United States, when they announced plans to locate in the United States, what tends to happen is we see a variety of states almost start to compete with one another as far as what kind of package can we put together to lure this manufacturer to our state. So what you see is across states kind of playing off of each other as far as what types of incentives to offer the company. Ultimately, the manufacturer is going to locate somewhere in the United States. So from that standpoint, where it specifically locates it's perhaps zero sum. But the idea here is that when the manufacturers are actually picking a state to locate in, it's based essentially solely on these types of goodies that can be offered, and you get these states playing off of each other. That is perhaps a bit troubling.
Now, again, with the case of the effect on taxes and the provision of jobs, economists do have some theories about what types of businesses or what type of industries might be able to have some kind of a general overall tax effect. And you talk about this some in your studies. So you could explain to us what types of businesses do economists think are particularly attractive to try to recruit in this fashion?
Right. So this goes back to the mid-1900s, a theory that kind of was brought up by some regional economists where we basically separate industries into those that are basic and those that are non-basic. The basic industries are those that are largely exporters, that will locate in a state like Alabama and bring in essentially money from outside the state or even outside the country in the case of a foreign manufacturer. And these businesses are the ones that you want to try to attract, these basic industries. Because that money that comes in from outside the state, outside the region, goes on to support all of the non-basic industries, the industries that are there basically just to support the basic one. So you locate a Mercedes plant in Alabama, it brings in a lot of money from outside the country and certainly outside the state. And that is now more money injected into the Alabama economy for people to go out and spend on things like restaurants, things like movies, things like that are more localized. And this is essentially the logic that's going on here. What this tends to mean is that we need to attract things like, if you're a proponent of this logic, attract things like manufacturers. You attract a company like Airbus because Airbus is going to be solely an export industry as far as Alabama is concerned.
Right.
I don't believe there's a single company in Alabama, based in Alabama anyway, that will be buying the planes that are being built at the Airbus plant. So that's essentially all money coming in from outside the state.
And many of these manufacturing companies are highly successful. They're producing products that are generating value, that are getting sold. Lots of people drive Mercedes cars, and so they are generating value to our economy in that sense.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's the logic behind this.
And one other, I guess, element of trying to recruit these manufacturers is you're not going to benefit one Alabama business at the expense of their competitors. Right. If you're looking at some retailers, for instance, if you're trying to benefit Walmart at the expense of other retailers, then there could be an element of this isn't a level playing field, or we're paying taxes to support our competitors.
Yeah, so that's certainly something to it as well, is that you get these industries into the state that are based solely, that are essentially driven almost primarily by factors that don't have anything to do with the internal economics of the state. And the idea is that, to your point, you don't have the issue as far as other industries, at least within the state, necessarily feeling like there's unfair competition going on.
Now, when we start to look at how these package deals have performed, I mean, there are a lot of different ways we could look at that question. But one question would be, since we've targeted, I think according to the economic base theory, we have targeted a bunch of manufacturing industries. is Alabama a manufacturing intensive state?
Yeah, and it certainly remains, I would say, a manufacturing intensive state. Alabama has historically always had a large share of its employment in the manufacturing sector. I think that I think we are 6th currently, at least of 2013, as far as states, where we actually have always had, or at least for the easy to remember past, we've always had a large share of our employment in the manufacturing sector, and that's continued to be the case since these incentive packages have kind of started.
Now, one of the factors that has to be taken into account in trying to evaluate how these packages have performed is that we do have a trend in the United States towards declining manufacturing employment, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And as this kind of really illustrates, if you go back further than this, which I think is 1969, if you go back further than this, Alabama and the United States kind of mirrored each other as far as the percentage of their employment that was involved in the manufacturing sector. But through time, what you see here are downward trends as far as manufacturing. Manufacturing, as is widely known, at least as a share of employment, is a declining industry. It's the same in Alabama as well, although the decline has not been nearly as severe. We've come down from being in the mid 20% range to I think we're roughly 17%, or a little less than that, but around there, whereas the United States has fallen off more significantly.
Which, of course, isn't necessarily a bad thing, because manufacturing output in the United States is higher than it's ever been. We're just producing more with fewer workers, and that's good for our economy. But it does mean that if we look at manufacturing employment in Alabama, and it's fallen since we've started undertaking all of these development incentive packages, it doesn't necessarily mean that the packages have failed.
Right, and because that's an important thing to mention, especially as we get into some of the more detailed on the specific industries. One of the things that's important to mention is that overall declines in manufacturing in the state are largely being driven by national trends, or even just trends within manufacturing itself. And while, to your point, we perhaps are manufacturing more than we ever have before, the all-important political idea as far as how many jobs do we have and the jobs we've created, as far as a share of employment, manufacturing is in decline in Alabama, just not to the same extent as it is nationwide.
Now, in your study, you looked at did a case study of 5 of these different development deals, and just in terms of, I think we'll focus on the Mercedes one most, but have they worked in terms of, have they brought companies, have they stayed, have they delivered in effect the promised jobs?
Yeah, so by and large, when you look at, so these are slides for Tuscaloosa County, which is where the Mercedes plant located. Certainly in the Mercedes case, this is usually heralded as this good achievement as far as economic development. And it is a plant that is still there. It's still extremely productive. It employs it employs lots of workers. And manufacturing in the county as a whole, as the first kind of panel there indicates, is manufacturing employment is actually larger as a share of total employment in Tuscaloosa County than it is in Alabama as a state, and then also nationwide. The growth there has been stronger. Right. So this would seem to at least give some kind of evidence to the idea that this Mercedes incentive deal has actually strengthened manufacturing in that area. Some of the other facilities that we looked at in the study, Hyundai, these are similar ones, similar results, that we do tend to see stronger manufacturing where these companies have located, where these incentives, which would seem to at least imply at least some evidence that these incentive deals have worked in the creation of manufacturing jobs.
Right. And they also, as the other diagrams here show, have contributed to the tax base in Tuscaloosa County, right?
Yeah, I mean, again, and this is essentially back of the envelope kind of calculation here, but it's looking at basically the growth rates of various taxes in Tuscaloosa County, again, where the Mercedes plant's located, and comparing it to, over the same period, what has happened to Alabama as a whole. And we do tend to see growth in the tax rates in that county that outpaces growth in the state as a whole.
And you look at several other cases. The Airbus one was too recent to be able to actually look and see what's happened with that. But some of these other ones that you've taken a look at, and generally they have at least delivered on in terms of more manufacturing jobs in the county where they're located.
Yeah, and to some extent that's to be expected because the company comes, it locates, it builds a plant, and then it goes out and it hires workers. And this is something that we would expect to see. It's something that economists famously refer to as this is the seen aspect of it as opposed to the unseen. And we do tend to see in the case of the Hyundai and the Honda and the TK, the steel company, we do tend to see that their impact, at least in terms of the rate of change, the growth rate as employment in manufacturing in those areas does seem to outpace national and state averages. So to that extent, you would say that these are at least doing that part of the aspect.
Of course, it hasn't been all success. The state has had at least one notable failure.
Right,
and in these big incentive deals.
Yeah. So what you're referring to here is the National Alabama. It was supposed to be a rail car manufacturing plant that has essentially been troubled from the outset. It was a large-scale incentive package. The company essentially never produced a rail car. It was at one point it was bought by the retirement system in Alabama, owned a large portion of it. A portion of the facility has now been leased out. So this has not been essentially the storybook the illustrative case, as it were, that the Mercedes deal was.
But of course, the costs when we do swing and miss, or we do have a failure, do have to be deducted off those successes that we've seen.
Absolutely, and I would even point to the relative success stories, the Mercedes, the Honda cases. What we should be really looking at is when you go and you look at the size of these incentive packages, the several $100 million that these tend to be, versus the, and admittedly, large number of jobs, 1,000 jobs, say, but look at the actual cost to the state in terms of how much per job created or something along those lines. These tend to be still in the hundreds of thousands of dollars for well-paying jobs, not jobs that tend to pay that highly.
And another issue that you looked at was the question of whether this a plant locates in Montgomery County or in Tuscaloosa County, and the question would be: is there any spillover benefits into the surrounding economy, surrounding counties? Is this leading to like a widespread manufacturing boom, or is it just basically largely concentrated? Right.
So at least in the kind of again. Growth accounting, if you will, that I did as part of this study, what you tend to see is that these do tend to be concentrated in the counties they're located in. The surrounding counties actually tend to underperform national and industrial trends. So you could take this to mean this is not indicative that because you located in Tuscaloosa County, it's essentially taking jobs from neighboring counties. It's not to say that necessarily. It could simply be the case that, well, look, this area was actually underperforming, so it's good we got the incentive in there. Perhaps. But to your point earlier, there is very little evidence that this is actually spilling over into neighboring counties. We don't see that same kind of growth rate that is so remarkable in the counties where these things actually locate in the surrounding areas.
Now, there's the larger question of to what extent are these manufacturing deals and these state-led incentive efforts contributing to a strong Alabama economy. And they've had largely effect of benefiting or bringing the companies that we've targeted to the state. But how is this helping or hurting our economy overall?
Right. So I mean, I think that that's a difficult question to answer, and it's the idea that it gets back to this thing I alluded to, this idea of the seen and the unseen, where we can see, and politicians love this, that you can see, like, look, we're going to build this plant, we're going to unveil this, we're going to hire these 1,000 people. We like to have the big press conference and even to point to it down the road and say, look, we're building Polaris vehicles in Alabama, and there was talk of having the Built in Alabama sticker on everything built here. What's much more difficult to see is what would have happened in lieu of the tax incentives. Presumably some of these companies would have located somewhere, be it in Alabama, perhaps in a neighboring state. We don't know. We also don't know what else the state could have been doing with this same tax revenue that has been abated, or even the money that's been spent. We don't know what else the state could have been doing with this. So as an economist and as somebody that kind of is in favor of lower regulatory burden and lower taxes across the board, I would tend to shy away from this as economic development and more towards the idea that we should actually be looking at lowering taxes across the board, because that is essentially guaranteed to attract industry. Perhaps not the big splashy type industry that a targeted specific tax package would get. But we do have good evidence that lower tax burdens lead to growth overall.
Of course, we have the picture here of former Governor Riley at the unveiling or the announcement of this. And politicians do this in part because voters want to see that it is the role of, or they want to see their government take steps to try to bring jobs, bring good jobs to our state. But is that really something that we should be looking to the political sector, our state government, to lead economic development?
Yeah, this is a great, and it's in some sense a much more fundamental question. Like, what is the actual role for government in this type of business? Is it actually to be out creating jobs? It seems to essentially be a very keen talking point for the last however many years, that this is a role of government. You're judged by how many jobs you've created, and specifically what types of jobs you've created. Again, I think that this is essentially, this is a problematic logic. It leads us to the idea that the government is here providing jobs, when it really is private businesses. Even in these cases, the government doesn't hire anybody to go work at the Mercedes plant. Perhaps they played a role in getting the Mercedes plant here, but the ultimate success of the Mercedes plant is on the products Mercedes producing and the management in that company and so on. As we see with the National Alabama case, just getting a business to locate here is essentially not the main driver of job creation. It is actually still the market, and it is actually still the entrepreneurial process. And that's something that I think is much more important to focus on, is a government that basically fosters that type of economic growth through a low regulatory and low tax kind of burden, to get these firms to locate here on their own so that they can basically operate and hire and create jobs on their own.
Now, just in wrapping up here, we've mentioned this before, but I think it's worth coming back to the fact that other states offer these type of packages. And so I think people could reasonably raise the point, like, we can't possibly stop doing this because all of our neighbor states will be doing this, and how will we ever attract any businesses, or won't our businesses leave our state if they're able to get similar deals elsewhere, and we just sort of like unilaterally disarm and not undertake these own deals themselves? What would you say here?
This is, again, it's a tricky point, and it's something that I think is a very important conversation to have. The idea that, if we don't do these, well then, or perhaps, well, yes, here in Alabama we don't like doing this, but we know South Carolina does it, so we have to kind of compete. Again, we have to kind of look at a couple different things here. If Alabama if Alabama were to become a very favorable business climate, where we had lower taxes across the board, where we got rid of some of these regulations, we got rid of some of the tax breaks that are so difficult we have to employ government people as part of the tax incentives. If we lowered it across the board, we already make the state more attractive. We also need to focus on the idea that if a business is locating in the state only because of these tax incentives, it's likely not an efficient proposition to begin with. And we've run into these types of issues that we've talked about in the past, where these don't ultimately pan out. So while it's certainly a difficult question, it's something that I think, and I don't have the silver bullet answer as far as, well, yeah, absolutely, let's abandon this practice. I do think it can be improved substantially just by looking at putting much less discretion in the hands of the politicians as far as picking the winners and losers, and taking a more across-the-board approach.
Well, thank you very much, George. I think it's been an interesting and valuable conversation. And thank you. Join us again next time for another EconVersations.